anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there. I won't be catching up on Reddit, I won't be watching any news. I'll let the planet spin without me, 'cause everything has been without me sometime. And everyone will be alright if I'm not live by satellite. It's a beautiful day, I'm running away. Don't bother to Facebook, message or call me, 'cause I'm living life in airplane mode and everything is okay. I just wanna play, unplug for the day and live in the moment, 'cause I'm living life in airplane mode, yeah. I'm always drowning in the static, I'd rather swim in crystal seas. My battery's been running low, I need to take it nice and slow for just a while. You won't be hearing about my weather, and you won't see my breakfast pics. For videos of kitty cats all gussied up in pretty hats, you'll have to wait. I hope it's not a tragedy, I hope you don't get mad at me. It's a beautiful day, I'm running away. Don't bother to Facebook, message or call me, 'cause I'm living life in airplane mode and everything is okay. I just wanna play, unplug for the day and live in the moment, 'cause I'm living life in airplane mode, yeah. Everything is now, everyone is everywhere, but no one seems to get up from their chairs. I'll come and sit with you, let's talk and have a drink or two. We'll open up the window for some air and hear the voices down the street of children playing on the beach. It's a beautiful day, don't take it away. I just want to play, 'cause I'm living life in airplane mode, yeah. It's a beautiful day, I'm running away. Don't bother to Facebook, message or call me, 'cause I'm living life in airplane mode and everything is okay. I just wanna play, unplug for the day and live in the moment, 'cause I'm living life in airplane mode, yeah.
Hello, hello, hello! Welcome, everyone. I'm glad.
Hello.
Yeah, we even have an Alex.
Yes, we do.
So, we are live. We have me. I'm Jeffrey, if you've never seen me before. And that guy over there is Alex.
It's a browser extension.
And that was a paid advertisement from somewhere. Hello, hello.
Well, yeah. So, gotta love YouTube videos that have end time credits. Despite the fact that I tell it to be quiet. Okay, there. That's killed now. We will never see that again. All right. So yes, we have two average-looking guys here, as RetroTam says. I'm Jeffrey. Guy over there, that way, is Alex. We're both the co-host of They Create Worlds, which you may or may not know. We don't know. How are you people? So, as has become a tradition for us, we are doing our annual live stream, and this is the big 3, maybe 4, who knows, parter on the entire video game history at a very macro level.
Yes, hopefully 3.
Hopefully 3.
3. Just for our sanity and our bladders and all of that. It's going to be a long stream, even
It will
keeping
be.
it to 3 episodes.
Yeah, most of our raw recordings actually end up to be around 2 hours, hour and a half to 2 hours. And then I cut it down to what you guys get at the end. But anyway, to celebrate this live stream, we are doing a giveaway. Right, Alex? Because we're crazy people.
That's right. Because I've written a book. Yay.
He has.
They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that created the video game industry, Volume 1. Part of this ever-expanding They Create Worlds brand, available from CRC Press, Amazon.com, other major online retailers, and from this stream right here for the low, low price of $0.
That is right.
And it'll even be signed by both of us. The book's by me, but the podcast and everything that Jeffrey does is a big part of kind of getting the word out. And so this is a podcast giveaway. We'll both sign the book. We'll even put a personalized message in there for lucky winner on stream. It's like $75 value because the book is ridiculously expensive, which is beyond my control. But
yep. So it'll look like this once we pick a winner. I'm just trying to get this thing to actually click the start button. There it is. There's the start button. We wish to start. Alright. We have found a start button. Alright. Entries are open. So all you have to do is do that exclamation point raffle. And we will do it. And we will continue to have this go on, and we'll do the pickup. We'll do the giveaway at the end of the... We'll pick the winner, and then I'll get in contact whoever the lucky person is and work out how to get it mailed to you. Let's see. I want to... But we're going to be starting the recording here in one moment. I think I got everything set up on my end, Alex. How about you?
Yep, I'm good to go. So just a reminder for the people out there already, we are actually recording a podcast. So this will be a stream of the reporting process. You can see how the sausage gets made. You can see how much I sound like Captain Kirk when recording a podcast. We will be interacting with our audience. Jeff is going to be keeping an eye on chat as much as he can. There probably won't be as much interaction as in a typical video game live stream, just because we are recording a podcast and we have to form complete sentences to the end of thoughts because coherently, because Jeff has a hard enough time making me sound coherent when we're not talking to people in the middle of things, and we don't want to drive him completely and utterly insane. His current level of insanity is a nice happy medium. So we will interact, but be patient with us as we record.
Alrighty. Okay, I think we are set to go. And I am set to record on my end, Alex. You ready for the countdown?
Absolutely.
Alright. 3, 2, 1. Press the red button.
Alrighty, let's see. Levels look pretty good on my end. So.
Yep, they look good on mine. And the thing there. For those viewing at home, you can actually see there is a clock. There should be a clock. Is there a clock? I can't actually see that right now.
No. Don't worry about
Okay,
that.
I'll worry about that later.
I'll keep an eye on it on my end.
Okay, my audio on my stream is too high. How about Alex's audio? All right. Okay, so Alex is fine. I am a little too loud. Okay, I turned myself down. So we should be good there. Okay, let us start the madness. Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
Today, we are going to look at something that is massive, huge, spans multiple decades, is the culmination of us just doing years of research, spending lots of money, and according to some people, wasting a lot of time. Video games. All of them.
That's right. That's right. Something we've never, ever done before in 117 episodes of this podcast. Talk about the history of video games. Never been done.
Who would do that kind of thing? That's just madness.
So, yeah, of course, this is our big three. Heaven help us, please be 3-part podcast of the year. We do one of those big ones every year. And this time, we thought it would be a good idea to just kind of do the history of everything because we're insane like that. Because obviously, we do a lot of episodes, a lot of in-depth looks at this and that. And we often allude to the big picture of video game history as we do that. But we never really do something that just kind of encompasses that entire history of video games, mostly because that's impossible to do in 2 hours or even the 6 hours that this is probably going to end up being. But we're going to do the best we can to do that because it just kind of makes sense to have a big overarching contextual thing. Of course, 5 years from now, I'll know more and this entire episode will be wrong. And then we'll have to do our revised history of video games, but that's fine because we do a 3-parter every year and we're going to run out, so that'll give us something to do 5 years down the line. So a few things here. First of all, welcome to our Twitch audience. We are live streaming this.
Hello.
I'm sure no one will be insane enough to follow this entire live recording, but we will hopefully have people popping in and out, be interacting with them. Not that that'll be heard on the final recording, but it'll be a good time, I hope, on that end. Then in terms of what these episodes are going to cover themselves, well, first of all, they're not going to cover everything. They can't. That's, I've written a nearly 600-page book just talking about the first decade of the video game industry, plus some prehistory stuff before that. And, even then you have to cut some stuff out. So we obviously cannot cover everything in a 6-hour podcast. So if your favorite moment, if your favorite part of the world just doesn't get in there, my apologies. It's impossible. Kind of the goal of what we're going to do here, what we're going to try to cover, is the big, broad steps that took the video game industry to where it is today. So, kind of what's big today and how the industry kind of naturally evolved in that direction. It is going to be an industry history. So we're not really going to get into game creation too much. I mean, there's some big games that we may briefly talk about that, but if you want more information on the games that really changed the world and why they changed the world, well, we've got you covered because last year we did the top 100 influential video games of all time. That was more focused on here are the games, here are the mechanics, here are the reasons these were big. This is going to be more of a look at how the industry developed, how the business developed, to a small extent, how society developed around the industry. Now, just as a reminder, I'm not a real historian. I just play one on TV. So the social history aspects, I'm not a social historian. I do think I'm a pretty good expert at this point on the business of the video game industry. So in the wider context, it might feel, a little bit less focused. But we do want to try to put a little bit of that broader context in as well to try to explain why video games are evolving the way they are within society. We are going to go all the way from the very beginning to the very end, though I think a lot of the meat of it will really be 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s. We'll kind of briefly catch up to the present, but it's not even really possible to have a lot of context on what's going on today. So that's kind of the roadmap, and we'll probably, run off the road into a ditch within the first 5 minutes. But
that's okay
you know.
because that is what is a rarity is we actually have an outline to follow. We haven't really had much in the way of notes because Alex just does all of this off his head, which frankly amazes me.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do cram in advance. I mean, I don't do it completely from memory, and occasionally I have to look stuff up as we go. But yeah, usually there's not an outline to the episodes. So
We
if
actually
they
have
ever,
one.
yes, I actually created an outline for this one because with a topic this gigantic, if I didn't create an outline, we'd be in trouble. We'll probably deviate completely from the outline, but at least I can always go back to that if I feel like I'm missing something important.
Always good. All right, so to start off with, we have the prehistory, the land before computers, the land before video games, the lands where we went, I just want to do some fun stuff with military stuff and shoot things over there.
Sure. So, in order to have a context for video games, um, first, it's helpful to have a kind of very uh, broad, very general overview of a definition of what kind of games we're going to cover. Uh, Ethan Johnson, one of the good friends of the show, who also does a lot of his own independent work, kind of collaborated with a couple of people, myself included, on kind of a rough definition of video games that does a pretty good job of encompassing what we want to talk about. I mean, is it the general usage, the common usage definition? No. Will it ever be the common usage definition? Probably not. But it's a good framework for what we're doing, because if you're going to talk about a big, broad topic, you need to have some idea of what you're talking about. This is one of those many pauses where I, look for things, the stuff that Jeff edits out later.
Yeah, they're lots of fun. Is they're trying to figure out what would Jesus game. Since we had to go from the very beginning, so we had the Big Bang, we have Jesus doing whatever, and then we have all these video games.
Well, I think that he would be kind of a casual game fan because he's a very busy individual.
True.
He doesn't have a lot of time to put into Grand Theft Chariot or something like that. So my guess is he would like a simple game, a casual game, and I'm thinking flipping tables. I think a table flipping game would work out really well for him.
Not Noah's Ark?
No. Table flipping game. Definitely.
Table flipping game.
Yes. You New Testament readers know what I'm talking about.
That's true.
So,
right. Yeah.
So, the kind of definition that works for what we're trying to do is, first of all, the video game contains electronic logic circuits. This excludes the whole realm of electromechanical games, the kind of coin-op games that were precursors to video games that the video game industry very much co-opted in its early days. You have to be powered by electronic logic circuits. We need to have a display. That display does not need to be a screen. It can be a teletype. It can be just about anything where you're projecting some kind of image. Except that this display does need to be controlled by the electronic logic circuits. That means there's a direct relation to the game program, whether that program is in hardware or software, and the screen with that game program and those electronic logic circuits being able to change the state of the program and can be defined arbitrarily. So it needs to have the ability to manipulate the screen or the display to have multiple game states. If you're just turning something off and on, if you've got a projector going, because there were a lot of early electronic games that had projectors, if you're just turning that projector on and off or switching between two projectors, that doesn't work. You actually have to be able to define arbitrarily the screen, multiple different outcomes. So even a simple tic-tac-toe game is fine for this definition, because even if you're just turning on and off individual lights, like in Birdie the Brain, an early computer program, then the fact that you can still have multiple states represented by those patterns of turned on and off lights, that counts. So be able to alter the state of the program and its display by means of interaction. So video games are interactive. You can't just be passively sitting back and watching a movie. You actually have to do something, even if it's just occasionally jiggling your joystick left or right in response to on-screen prompts like in Dragon's Lair. Be driven by goals, intrinsic or extrinsic, which constitute a state change in the program. So one thing that you can get caught up in with a definition like this, and in fact, Ethan did this in response to a video by Ahoy, a wonderful video by Ahoy, which we'll, of course, now put in the show notes, about how you define a video game, is that you have to eliminate like a DVD menu. So technically a DVD menu, if you're moving stuff up and down with your remote, technically you've got electronic logic circuits, you're changing the display, it can be defined arbitrarily, you're altering the state of the program through interactivity. So we have to have actual goals. It has to be a game. Be driven by goals and have goals which can be accomplished using means inherently discernible by the machine's main output. So it has to be a game. There has to be objectives. It doesn't have to be fun, but it has to be a game.
Game-like.
Exactly. So there's a quick and dirty definition of video games as we define them for the purpose of our work here today. Anyway, getting that all out of the way, let's finally dive into the actual history and get this started. Video games, of course, don't exist without electronics and without computers. And this is why there are no video games or computer games before the middle of the 20th century. The real impetus and the real move towards electronic entertainment, or really electronic capability in general, really sprung out of World War II. World War II was a war that was waged very much with science as much as it was waged with boots on the ground. In fact, there's a very convincing argument to be made that the science part of the war was important. I mean, you needed the armies there to kind of stop each other from overrunning more territory, stop the Nazis or the Japanese from overrunning more territory, and you had to have boots on the ground to retake the territory. But it was really the advance of technology that allowed the war to have the result that it did. Britain would have probably been completely overwhelmed early on in the war if it wasn't for the technology of radar helping them, for instance, in the Battle of Britain. It was never perfect, but there was a lot of work done on it. And of course, the science behind the atomic bomb is a large part of what brought the war to its conclusion, at least in the manner that it was brought to a conclusion. We won't get into deep historical World War II arguments about what if this happened, what if that happened, because, we're probably already over time, even with what I've said so far. So, anywho, there were a lot of technological advances that happened in World War II, but the two that are really important to us is that advance of radar and then the advances that were being made in control systems. Radar is incredibly important to modern electronic entertainment because really that's when screen technology first got really refined. There were televisions. Television was invented. There were mechanical process as far back as the 19th century, but they didn't work very well. They weren't practical. But television for practical purposes was invented in the 1920s. It was made watchable by the end of the 1930s. But the technology was still expensive. The technology was finicky. The screens were infinitesimally tiny. Definitely no 65-inch screens back in 1939 at the World's Fair when RCA was debuting some of the earliest televisions. So there was a lot of refinement that needed to be done, components and technology and manufacturing, just in cost reduction, in order to really make the television a practical form of mass market entertainment. And radar research during World War II was really what brought that about, because with radar, you need a screen, you need tubes, you need electronics driving the display. And so that's when a lot of that technology was figured out. It's really also when the first computer memory technology was figured out as well. And we're talking about the really early stuff that we won't go into in detail here, like Mercury delay line memory and CRT memory. Because radar, the real problem was you ping a radar off a location and it's going to bounce off of everything that's there: trees, large animals, rocks, etc. There's no trying to figure out what's coming towards you, the enemy that's coming towards you. You don't want to know where all the trees are. So they had to come up with ways to differentiate moving objects, rapidly moving objects, from just background objects. And the way they did that, the way they solved that, is by very briefly keeping a complete radar image in memory and then comparing the next radar ping, the next radar bounce, with the previous radar bounce stored in memory, and then anything that appears in the exact same location in both is filtered out of the final display that the radar operator actually sees. So it's kind of the beginning of sophisticated displays. It's kind of the beginning of computer memory in radar. The other side of this that is very important is control systems. Now, computers were largely invented in response to the needs of World War II. There had been a couple of computers before World War II. I'm not saying that there had never been a computer. This is not a history of computing podcast, so I'm not going to go into that kind of detail, obviously.
We did a few episodes on it anyway.
Absolutely. But for our purposes, and the purposes of this podcast, computers really come out of World War II. And the primary paradigm, of course, in the early days of computing was batch processing, where you line up a bunch of calculations in a row, feed them all in at the same time, whether that's on magnetic tape or paper tape or punched cards or whatever method you're using. And then it performs all of those calculations, functions in sequence. And then you get a final result at the end, and heaven help you if you mispunched one of your cards or dropped them all on the way to the computer lab and got them out of order. That's obviously not going to be the basis for a computer game industry, an electronic game industry, a video game industry.
There was barely anything to solve a math problem.
Exactly. And this was still a predominant mode of computation for several decades. But for our purposes, what you really needed was a paradigm shift over to real-time systems. So if there's an inflection point for everything that is to come in electronic games, it is really the Whirlwind computer, which was created at MIT in the Lincoln Labs. Whirlwind, we won't go into huge detail, but it started as a flight simulator. It was going to be a universal flight trainer that could model any flight conditions, any model of aircraft, by just flipping a few switches rather than having to do custom builds for every type of airplane in existence. It started as an analog computer, but it soon became apparent that an analog computer, which means that instead of using numbers, ones and zeros to simulate things, it actually has to use actual electromechanical phenomenon to simulate things, was not going to be fast enough to do this. And so they had to come up with a real-time electronic digital system in order to make this work. The flight simulator went way over budget, but then and was going to be canceled most likely. But then after the war, when the Soviets developed an atomic bomb in 1949, after the Americans did, then there was a great necessity to have an early warning system that would blanket the entire United States to stop a long-range Soviet bomber, because we're in the days before we have ICBMs, so a nuclear or even nuclear submarines. So at this point, an attack would come from a long-range bomber coming from Western Russia over Alaska and Canada. We needed an early warning system that would blanket the entire nation. And so that's where you get the need for real-time computing. That's where you get a computer that can actually update in real time and respond instantaneously to input. So a lot of what we think of today as computing really originated with Whirlwind. The idea that you are typing on a keyboard and you are immediately seeing on a screen a change in the state of the computer based on what you just typed with that keyboard, that comes from Whirlwind and from the Sage defense system that sprang from Whirlwind. The idea that you're interacting directly with objects on a screen with some kind of pointer, that also comes from Whirlwind. There was no mouse at that time. They were using light pens, but that whole idea comes from Whirlwind. Even the idea of computers communicating with each other remotely through use of a modem comes from Whirlwind. The modem was invented by AT&T, and by its Bell Labs research arm, but it was first deployed, or at least first deployed in a meaningful way, in the Sage system. So this is really the beginning of the computing environment that can be used for games. But of course, it's a huge command and control system that takes up half an acre of space and is super expensive and needs air conditioning and all of that. So you're not really doing games on it, really, but it's the beginning of it. Though I should say that the first thing that could be considered a game, what we right now think is the first thing you could consider an electronic game. It's important not to get too caught up in firsts, because there's always something.
I mean, to restart things, to make it all work. You there, Alex?
I'm here. I don't think we're live yet, though.
I guess we had to restart the stream.
Oh, okay.
Which means I have to take you, pop you out, throw that over here, set you at max, and there we go. And sorry about that. We had my ISP decided they didn't like me anymore for some reason. Let me take a moment here to fix Alex's video, which was all set up beforehand, but you know.
Oh, I thought I had just transformed into a skyscraper. Whoa.
Here we go. So there we go. We're back to normal. We are restored to glory and wonderful happiness for everyone.
That actually happened at an opportune moment, because I had just stopped talking and was just about to ask everyone out in Twitch land how they were doing. And then
so how is everyone doing?
That's right. I don't have chat up. I probably should, but Jeff does. He's
I do.
looking at it. I should probably have that up.
It can probably help. But that's easy enough to do. But yeah, my ISP decided they wanted to choose that wonderful moment to just die. And anyone who's had Charter probably knows that thing. And I have an ancient mantra of going, Charter! Why? Anyway, we got as far as, from when I last heard you, we got up to, you were done with Whirlwind, you were at the Lincoln Lab microcomputer section and defining video games. That sound about right?
I hope we weren't gone that long.
I have a terrible memory as a species. You know that.
Oh, I was about to talk about bouncing ball. Okay, so I guess stream got lost before I lost Jeff, because I could still see the stream long after bouncing ball.
Yep. That's okay. I can fix it in post. I'm good at fixing
Oh yeah,
things
no,
in
I mean,
post.
I mean, the recording picked it up. It's just our live audience isn't going to get the benefit of everything that was said, unfortunately. But you'll have to. I guess you'll just have
Incentive to download the episode.
Yeah, you'll just have to listen to the episode, as horrible as that sounds. So yeah, I was about to talk about Bouncing Ball. I actually did talk about Bouncing Ball. I'm over it now. That period of history is over. I declare that period of history dead. I'd actually just finished talking about Whirlwind entirely.
Okay.
So to just summarize in 2 seconds for our live audience here, obviously you'll cut this out of the podcast itself. But hold on 1 second. I'm such a neophyte. How do I, with Twitch, how do I set this so I just have the chat and not the video stream?
There
I'm
is
showing,
a.
I'm showing my ignorance to the world.
I know. I actually use a different thing, but there should be a button on the right that lets you pop out chat. Or once you have the chat window out there might be near the top or the bottom something that lets you pop the chat out. Settings, then pop out. Yeah, we're a bunch of old guys who have no idea how the newfangled technology works. How did the newfangled technology work? No one knows.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
settings.
Can't I just edit AutoExecBat to make this happen?
No. This isn't how Wing Commander works. We already covered Wing Commander and how to make it start. This isn't the Wing Commander equivalent of holding down the reset button. Oh, for this issue, it's config.sys. Oh, okay. But anyway.
Technical difficulties.
Everyone loves technical difficulties. They're so much fun. They lead to entertainment, and this is the kind of fun, entertaining stuff that I usually rip out of every episode. Like technical difficulties, looking up things, how to figure out this stuff works. Right, you click the little settings thing.
That's what I thought, but I'm not. Oh, there we go. It's because the mod settings were up. Ha ha. There we go.
We have capabilities. Alex can now read you in addition to me. But I'm probably the only one who's going to type back to you. But we have lots of quizzes.
How do they work? Well, I mean, you press the power button and they turn on. That is how they work. Thank you for attending my TED Talk.
Oh my. That's one heck of a TED Talk.
All righty. Now I can see chat. I can see my outline. I can see Jeff.
It's
without
wonderful.
seeing Jeff twice.
Wait,
and hopefully, well, because I had you up in Discord and had you up in stream.
Oh my.
And now we can get back to work. So for all of you that were looking forward to Whirlwind as the highlight of the entire talk, the entire episode, well, we're moving past that now. Because this is already way too long. As I did say, which I think got cut off, the way this is going to work, I'm going to go into detail on the first few topics, look at the time, absolutely panic, realize that there is no time, skip through the next 15 items like way too fast, then look at the time, feel relieved again, and then find a happy medium. So yes, this is definitely all Hubs's fault. That checks out.
Oh, good.
Okay, so moving on. The other important thing about Whirlwind is Whirlwind was a gigantic command and control system. So even though Whirlwind pioneered this entire concept of real-time computing, the type of real-time computing that Whirlwind did still wasn't in any way appropriate to doing a computer game or an electronic game, because this was all about lots of people sitting at a gigantic computer and just taking in input and responding to input as it's controlling something gigantic. In this case, a whole defense system. You needed kind of an idea of personalizing real-time computer use as well. And that's really where the importance of Ken Olsen and the Digital Equipment Corporation come in, because it was really Ken Olsen and Wes Clark, who were both at Lincoln Labs and both working with Whirlwind and with Sage, who came up with the idea of, okay, now we've got a system that we can respond to in real time. Why don't we adapt this so that it's useful in a laboratory setting where a scientist or an engineer can work one-on-one with that computer and interact with it in real time and get immediate results as they're doing their work. So at this point, you get the whole concept of a small transistorized real-time computer. Now, that won't gain the name mini computer yet for several years. The PDP-1 is sometimes in shorthand referred to as a mini computer, but technically it's really not, even though it is much smaller and much cheaper than a giant mainframe, batch processing mainframe, or a giant command and control system, because it only costs around $120,000 rather than costing millions of dollars. Now, we have to remember that is $120,000 in 1960s money, so that's still a heck of a lot. But it's not millions in 1960s money, so we've made progress. It's that paradigm shift that Ken Olsen and Wes Clark and Ben Gurley, who actually designed the PDP-1, it's that paradigm shift that these folks made that created an environment where we could have these kinds of games. So there were experiments within the military industrial complex in the 50s, people that had access to big computers, people that were doing serious work, usually for the government, often in a military capacity at think tanks like the Rand Corporation. They were making war games. They were making simple AI programs. They were doing chess routines. They were doing this kind of stuff. But the real ground zero for the start of something that could turn into an entertainment industry, as opposed to let's just research how some of the stuff works, it really does start with Space War. I mean, if there is another inflection point, I know I already called Whirlwind's creation an inflection point, but if there's another inflection point for the real start of electronic entertainment, it's Space War.
Of course, you
And of
need
course,
two inflection points. That's the only way you can have a round circle, or at least a lens, so that you can focus in on the topic.
There you go. Two inflection points to focus in on the topic. I like that.
There you go.
So Space War is really the beginning of anything. And it, of course, comes out of MIT. And the real paradigm shift here, and the real thing that makes this possible, is that when you have a small interactive computer like the PDP-1, you can do research with it faster. It's not going to necessarily be in use 24/7, but you on 24/7, because back in those days, powering a computer on and off was a very fraught and very scary and very power consuming, tech consuming process. So you really never wanted to shut a computer off back in those days, except when you had to take it offline for maintenance or whatever. So a computer like the PDP-1 or a batch processing mainframe is going to be running all the time. But a computer like the PDP-1 that isn't running big, complex calculations all the time, that's being used on a more ad hoc basis for individual research projects as they come up, is not going to be in use all the time like a batch processing mainframe would be. And this created an opportunity for students, for employees, and quite simply for just hangers-on to interact with the computer and use that computer in a way that wasn't tied to serious work. So the first generation of computer programmers and operators, they were using these computers for serious work, and they couldn't really conceive of using it for anything else except for real one-off kind of demonstrations like Higginbotham's Tennis for Two. Higginbotham may put together a tennis program for an open house, but he's not going to keep a game together and keep a game running all the time. He used it one fall, he used it the next fall, he dismantled it. Now we have a computer that's going to be up all the time, but that people can co-opt for games. And even though the professors and the researchers are probably not going to be interested in that, these people have slave labor. I mean, they have graduate students that have the time and have the inclination to play around with these computers a little bit. And so that's where you get the culture around the PDP-1 and around MIT of the so-called hacker culture, where these people that are interested in technology, that are interested in modifying technology, many of them associated with the Tech Model Railroad Club and the electronics involved in that, computer and are like, this is something we can have fun with. And people at the university are like, okay, fine, have fun with that. And this goes back to Whirlwind too, because the person that decided to do this was Jack Dennis, who had worked on Whirlwind as a student, who loved going in when no one was on the computer and doing his own programming, and thought people doing their own programming was valuable. So, to make a long story short, way too late, Jack Dennis allows people on the computer, people get interested in using the computer, and out of this comes Space War. We have a whole episode on Space War, so I won't talk about it any more than that. I've already talked about it too much as it is. But that's the main paradigm shift, is that you have a real-time computer that is geared towards more personal use, that's going to be on all the time, but won't be in use all the time. And that's how you get an environment where you can actually have a game. So Space War, of course, is incredibly influential because it spreads. It's not just that it's the first kind of real fun entertainment, always or semi-always available game in a single location. It spreads around the country. And it is, of course, the direct influence on the beginning of the video game industry, because Nolan Bushnell sees it at the Stanford AI lab where Steve Russell brought it. And yes, he saw it at Stanford. We won't get into that whole debate, but I am 100% convinced he did not see it at the University of Utah, and we have other episodes to cover that. So that's how we get the transition. You have something that can appear everywhere. Then you have time sharing developed, which we'll go into more detail later, which allows lots of programs to be run at once. So when in Space War's early days, you just had to be playing it when nothing else was going on. Then time sharing comes along, allowing multiple users to use the computer at the same time. And at that point, you can play Space War even while other things are going on. And this is what opens up computing as to something that can be done recreationally a lot of the time, even if it's only being done recreationally in computer labs. Well, yes, I suppose it's technically 99.9%. We as historians should never be irresponsible enough to say that we're 100% anything. But it's definitely 99.9 repeating. So that's a good point. This is the first time I've actually had chat up while we're doing this, so I'll probably get more distracted and it'll be a disaster, but oh well. So, Space War begats computer space. And computer space is the beginning of this idea that we can take these computer games that are existing only in a lab state right now on very expensive machines and put them it's a good thing I am watching chat, or I would have really been wondering what was going on there.
This is the
So
fun we can have.
exactly. So Space War begats computer space, and computer space begats the idea that you can play these games outside of a closed computer lab that is accessible by only a limited number of people, and you can have something that could potentially become a mass market entertainment. Now, of course, at this point, computer technology, even really stripped down computer technology like the type that Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney used in Computer Space, is still very expensive. This is not something that can be, at this juncture, a home entertainment product and be in any way interesting. Sorry, Ralph Baer. Kudos for your invention, but Bushnell has a point when he says it's just not that interesting. I'm sorry. I hope I didn't just lose half the stream there.
Nope.
But oh, go ahead, Jeff.
I said, nope, you didn't lose them.
But you couldn't really do something interesting in the home at this point. But of course, fortuitously, there was already a mass market widespread a commercial entertainment arena into which something like this could be placed, and that was the coin operated amusement industry. We've done a whole episode on that, of course. So the whole point of this is not to dwell. It's going to kill me not dwelling over this whole thing. I'll feel like so much has been left out, but we'll get through this together.
You have
Jeffrey,
to make all those shout outs to previous episodes
Yeah.
that cover all this.
Jeffrey, myself, and Twitch chat, we'll get through this together. It'll be group therapy. It'll be great. As Alex has a nervous breakdown because he didn't cover something. But the coin-operated amusement industry, at this point, we kind of have to define briefly what that was. Of course, consumption of short experiences that are activated by inserting a coin. For a while, that was a penny or a nickel. In the 50s, it became a dime. This period of time, it's become a quarter, though a dime play mentality still kind of exists a little bit. Pinball is still 2 plays for 25 cents, for instance. You insert a quarter, you get 60 to 90 minutes. Wow, that would break the whole industry. 60 to 90 seconds of entertainment, and you'd be able to have an experience that you couldn't have anywhere else, often geared around sights or sounds as much as around games, though by the 1970s, it had mostly settled into games. And this was an industry that was always, it was a cheap form of entertainment. So it's always something that had a connotation of being lower class. It's usually things that people of less means can't afford, people of more means can afford. It started with phonographs because the average person couldn't afford a phonograph. It moved to peep shows because the average person couldn't go to the theater. And at this time, we're talking stage theater. We're not talking movie theaters. Then it moved on to elaborate entertainment experiences that were just impossible in the home, with some simulation elements mixed in, like holding a light gun and shooting at a target, or sitting down at a steering wheel and driving a toy car, that kind of thing. And by the 1970s, the industry was in a lot of decline. There'd been consolidation. Before World War II, there were a lot of operators and jobbers all around the country running this stuff, and games were thriving. After the war, games were starting to fall by the wayside because the population was dispersing, and you could no longer have these big inner city arcades that everyone was going through that had a lot of turnover. And at the same time, you had the jukebox still kind of holding primacy in the recording industry. And so you had a consolidation where basically coin-operated amusements became subservient to the jukebox industry. What this meant that the people operating jukebox routes were the same people operating the video, or operating the coin-operated games. So instead of big arcades, you still had a few inner city arcades that were out there. You mostly had games appearing in the same locations that jukeboxes were appearing in. And that meant taverns. You had a few people that were getting into other locations like discount stores, or bowling alleys, roller rinks, as kind of appendages to that. But you were talking mostly a bar and tavern trade. And you were talking about most places just having 1 or 2 pinball machines, or 1 or 2 shuffle alleys if they were in a place where pinball was illegal, which is a lot of places at that time. And then having a jukebox, having maybe a coin-operated pool table or 2, and then a cigarette vending machine, which was the one type of vending machine the jukebox operators operated. They didn't do the soda machines and snack machines. That was a whole different industry. We are so over time.
Yes, we are.
To
be fair, at least 10 minutes of that is probably the internet going out.
Oh, I know, and some of it's we'll make it work.
We'll make it work. We always do somehow.
Well, what we'll probably have to do is end up making tough choices and actually cutting some of what I say in the episodes that go out, and then we can let Patreons have access to the director's cut, which is in all of its 50-hour glory. You all are
Or we
stay
can
with
make
us.
it 4 episodes or 5 episodes.
Oh God.
Or
Oh
heaven
God.
forbid, 6.
I mean, you guys in chat, you'll stay with us for 50 hours, right? We're here till the end.
Of course we are. We'll just make it 4 or 5 episodes. We'll make it a whole new thing. It's like every year live stream. It's like we add an extra episode on. So we had the 4 episode one for Atari. And...
I mean, you're wearing your Depends, Jeff, right? You prepared for this.
No.
Oh dear. This could get messy.
Oh no. Oh, we know we're recording it because we have nice little buttons that are saying and things that say even recording. I even changed it so you can actually see what I have as the actual time now and that I'm actually recording.
Yes. Though the computer could always be lying to us. Computers like to do that.
Computers can lie, but they only have truth. They have on and off. They can't lie. There's no ambiguity. That's not how this works.
But if you put enough ons and offs in sequence. Anyway, so there was this existing infrastructure that could take a more expensive product and commoditize it 60 to 90 seconds at a time. And that's how computer space and that's how video games were introduced into the world. But they were introduced in a very particular context because it really was a bar and tavern trade, which meant that you could not have anything too complicated because you're talking about a situation where people are having drinks and probably having a lot of drinks, and they're trying to socialize. They're trying to meet other people oftentimes, and they are not there to figure out a complicated game. And this is why computer space failed. There's been a strange movement, and I'm not sure why, by a couple of people in academia to say that when Nolan Bushnell is talking about how the patron at the beer bar couldn't handle computer space or couldn't understand computer space, that he's somehow being classist and somehow saying, well, those dumb hicks in the beer bar had no idea what they were doing because they're stupid. And it's not a class thing. Now, it does happen that the environment was working class bars. I mean, that's kind of the way it was because coin operated amusements, it's a cheaper form of entertainment. It's the kind of entertainment for people that don't necessarily have a lot of money. These weren't showing up in cocktail lounges in high class bars where people that were a little better off were around. So there is a class element to early video games in that sense. You're looking primarily at working class people or at students, especially in areas around, say, Stanford. So there is a class element to it in that, but it's not that poor working class slobs couldn't handle it. It's that a complicated product is not a good fit for a bar. Video games get more complex later. Video games get very complex later, and people of all walks of life play them later. But at that point, the video game has spread to other venues. It is spread to the shopping mall arcade. So even it doesn't matter what your income level is or your education level is. If you're a working stiff or a white collar big shot or a student or a stay-at-home mom or whatever you are, it's the venue that matters. A beer bar is not the place for complex entertainment. A shopping mall arcade is, because if you're going to a shopping mall arcade, you're specifically going to be challenged by the machine. So computer space is a failure because it's a bar industry. The shopping mall arcade, for all intents and purposes, does not exist in 1971. The first few have started to appear, but it's not widespread. And this is why we needed to go back to the drawing board, and video games had to start out very simple. And this is, of course, where Ralph Baer does play a very big role, because Ralph Baer is the first person to bring video games into the home. Because he had to keep the technology cheap, he had to do something very simple. He had spot generating hardware that could only display 3 dots and a line of varying height. That's all the technology he could put in. And so while his team is working on this, they're coming up empty on how to make this fun. He and his technician Bill Harrison, they've done some chase games where dots are pursuing each other. They've done some target shooting games where you shoot the dot with a light gun that are okay. They're not terrible, but you can't include the light gun with the basic system just because, again, the expense. They create the light gun as an add-on. They do a pumping game where you're just furiously pressing a button to raise the level of the dot to simulate like a bucket filling. And that's just terribly boring. That's so boring it doesn't even make it into the final product. But then Bill Rush comes up with the idea, well, we've got 2 dots on the screen. What if we put a 3rd dot on them and make that machine controlled? Because at the time they were thinking about player elements. So you had 2 players. That's really all they could do. So you had 2 dots. Bill Rush had the breakthrough of we can have dots that are not players. Let's put a 3rd dot up there and let's play table tennis. And so you get the first concept that really works in both being simple and cheap. You don't need a lot of elements to do that. It's intuitive, easy to pick up, easy to understand, but it can be fun to play under the right circumstances. So the Brown Box team, the Magnavox Odyssey team, creates a table tennis game, as well as a lot of others. Nolan Bushnell sees this table tennis game when the Odyssey is being demoed. And then Al Alcorn at the newly founded Atari turns this into something more sophisticated and more fun because with coin-operated hardware, you can do a little more with it. The brilliance of Pong and the reason it kind of launches the whole industry is you can stick it in a bar. People will understand it right away. It has a single control, and 2 people can challenge each other and have fun with it. And that's what really makes video games take off. They used to say back in the early days that the best games were simple games with just a single controller because you could control the game with one hand and hold your beer in the other hand. And that's really what you needed in the early days because it was a bar market. So there was the Magnavox Odyssey. The Odyssey was really not very successful in its early days, though. For the purposes of this grand overview, the importance of the Odyssey is that it leads to Pong, and Pong is something that's simple, easy to understand, can be played in bars, can be understood even when you're drunk off your gourd, and people can have a good time with. So this really establishes video games in this industry. And it came along at a time that was very important within the industry. If it had come along a little sooner, it might not have caught on in the same way that it did. But it actually happened to come along in a period of coin-op expansion and coin-op legitimization. The coin-op industry for a long time had been plagued by the gambling element because back in these times, the amusement industry, which we're talking about pinball, shuffle alley, target shooting games, driving games, etc., and the gaming industry, which we're talking about slot machines and gambling machines, were very intermixed, were very inbred, and there was lots of crossover because games of amusement were often modified into games of chance. So there was this inextricable link in the public mind between coin-operated amusements, gambling, and organized crime. And the fact that the jukebox operators were largely doing this cash-only business in working class, lowbrow areas increased this stigmatization, this idea that coin op is low class, lowbrow, dirty, organized crime, gambling, bad, not in our community, which is why a lot of major cities like New York and Los Angeles banned pinball. Even Chicago banned pinball.
Which is kind of funny
Chicago's where all
considering
the-
that's where they came from.
Exactly. That's where the industry was centered, was in Chicago. So there was this stigma attached to it. That stigma was starting to change in the late 1960s, though, because you had a new wave of more sophisticated games coming in. And we have to give Bill Nutting a lot of credit here. You know, Bill Nutting in video game history often just gets a bad rap, the founder of Nutting Associates that produced Computer Space, because in the context of video games, he's usually just portrayed as, and then this small California company, Nutting Associates, decided to take a chance on the game, and they made a few, and then it flopped, and then we never hear from Nutting again. And from a video game perspective, there is perhaps a little bit of truth to that. But we have to understand that Nutting got into the business with the game Computer Quiz in 1966-67, which was adapted from the earlier Knowledge Computer from 64, which was probably adapted from an even earlier quiz game made in Detroit in 1946 called Telequiz. But Computer Quiz came along in the late 1960s. It felt like a more sophisticated product. It felt like an educational product. It felt like a legitimate product. It felt like something that had value beyond gambling. It felt like a cleaner product. It got into new venues. It got into transportation depots, bus and rail. It got into department and discount stores, you know, maybe at the front door. It got into large apartment complexes. It got into student unions. Colleges were often hesitant to put pinballs in because of the gambling stigma. So it opened up new venues, and then a new wave of games from Japan that were more realistic and were based on primarily things like target shooting and driving, which were completely divorced from the gambling element entirely, kind of followed in their wake. So there was a technological renaissance going on in coin-op. There was a gradual expansion of coin-op into new, slightly more respectable venues. And it was right in this period that Pong hit. So Pong felt like the continuation of this legitimization. First, we had these elaborate electromechanical shooting and driving games. Now we have this elaborate video game. And at this time, computers were really associated with the pioneering leading edge of human achievement and human technology. We have to remember that the space race had just concluded in 1969. There was this real awakening to the idea of futuristic technology, of science, of exploration across the entirety of America. I mean, astronauts became heroes. Young kids were drinking Tang because that's what the astronauts drank. World's fairs, like the 1964 World's Fair in New York, were really focused on the world of tomorrow and a science fiction future. And computers and screens and video screens were a part of this romanticization of science that was occurring in this period in American society. So when you saw something that felt futuristic like Pong, or even like Computer Space, even though Computer Space was a failure, it had that real sexy fiberglass cabinet that just looked so futuristic. When you saw these machines, this looked like not the smoke-filled pool hall, not the smoke hall, not the shady bar where you never want your kids to get anywhere near. This like modern technology, modern entertainment for the modern world. And it really helped legitimize the entire idea of coin-operated entertainment, which for so long had been lost in the shadows of gambling and whatnot. So Pong creates a revolution, but it's a short-lived revolution. It distributes broadly, it's cloned broadly, it gets in every nook and cranny of society, and it also opens new venues that hadn't been available to coin-operated games generally before, like high-end cocktail lounges and lobbies of high-end hotels and things like that. That's right. We're going to do this whole thing one game at a time, and our history of video games will be a million episodes. Though, in all fairness, the whole podcast is the history of video games. So we're already this is already episode 118 of our infinite series on the history of video games.
I'm frankly
technically
amazed we made it to 118.
So, but the other side of the coin op industry is that the coin op industry is very faddish. After pinball was kind of pushed to the margins of the industry, which was happening throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s with regulation. Pinball's still very popular. There's still lots of pinball machines coming out, but it's no longer able to stand at the center. The industry became known for a faddish mentality where you would introduce the latest, greatest thing, whether that be shuffle alleys or bumper pool or the audiovisual driving games, the realistic games. And someone would put something like that out. There would be a lot of copycats of that product. And then the whole market would kind of rise, and then it would fall as the next big thing came on. It's a novelty category. It's always been based on novelties from the 19th century when it first came about. So Pong was a success, but Pong rose really fast as a dozen or so companies got in and started making them. And then it fell really fast because ball and paddle was very simplistic. They made modifications. There were hockey games, basketball games, elimination where four players are guarding corners. There were a lot of variants on this, but it couldn't progress too far. And so TV games were really seen by the larger industry as ball and paddle games. Most of the industry was unable to break out, no pun intended, from that mentality because the existing companies were used to being focused on a single concept, taking that concept as far as it could go and then moving on to the next thing. There wasn't the imagination or oftentimes, quite frankly, the technical skill to move beyond ball and paddle video for the majority of the industry. So it rose up, it got big, and then it collapsed kind of in a very short period of time. Pong did not really launch the video game industry or even the coin-op video game industry. But it did help in this process of legitimization.
It
And
made
that
it
in
the
itself was
mainstream
very
thing.
exactly, and that in itself was very important because it's in the wake of Pong and in the wake of these video games that you start to get the move into the shopping malls. Of course, Jules Millman, the founder of Aladdin's Castle, is the person that was most important to this. He was not the only one that was founding arcades and shopping malls, but Aladdin's Castle became the biggest one, and he was kind of the first one that had the idea, well, why don't we clean this up? Because oftentimes these inner city arcades or these games and bars, no one's really watching them. No attendant is there to really enforce the rules. So there's drinking, there's smoking. You have, gangs of delinquents hanging out. Some of this is stereotype, obviously. It's not that every single location was this den of iniquity, but the perception of arcades as a den of iniquity was largely due to the lack of care in observing public behavior and maintaining the rules of the space. And so because they had these reputations as being dirty and unwatched and a haven for delinquents, respectable businesses just didn't want them around. Shopping malls, which at that time were the height of respectable American business, did not want them around. Jules Millman was able to change that by saying, let's put very strict rules in about eating, drinking, smoking. Let's make sure that we have enough attendance on site that they can all keep an eye on what's going on and can enforce the rules. And let's keep the space clean. And, he had trouble getting people to accept any of this at first, but he happened upon a mall that wasn't doing well, that was desperate enough to try it out. It worked out. Everyone was happy. Other Chicago area shopping malls, because he was based in the Chicago area, were like, okay, that's working. We'll do this too. And it kind of spread out from there. So that's where you get the transition, as I was talking about earlier, to the concept of the shopping mall arcade, a place where it feels okay to come and just enjoy the amusements and not have a stigma of gambling, not have a stigma of drinking, not have a stigma of smoking, and not have a stigma of delinquency. Obviously, as video games explode in popularity later, all of those same accusations will start catching up again. So we're going to have that same cycle where it's like, well, bullies are beating up weak kids for their lunch money so they can have quarters to go skip school and play in the arcades, and they're smoking around the back, and it's just terrible. But there's a brief period here where the shopping mall arcade becomes desirable, becomes respectable, and even becomes a place where parents can feel safe dropping off their children to play some games while they go off and do their shopping. So now you have a venue to create a true entertainment industry. In the bars, you were never going to get beyond really simple concepts. But the shopping mall arcade that Pong helps legitimize, that video games help legitimize, gives you a space to create an entertainment industry. At this point, what we need to really grow the industry, though, is we need the technology to improve. And that's really where the whole advance in the semiconductor industry gets into it. The semiconductor industry is something else that really grows out of the military industrial complex. In the days of World War II and Korea and the space race, these three things kind of happen boom, boom, boom. You have World War II, which greatly increases government R&D spending. Government R&D spending immediately after the war comes back down. The Korean War reignites government R&D spending again. And that goes up, up, up until that war ends. Then you have one final lull, and then Sputnik happens, and they panic about the technological arms race with the Soviet Union, particularly as it pertains to space. And so now you have government spending really skyrocketing. You have DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA at the time, I suppose. They didn't focus on it yet. But you had ARPA, you had NASA, of course, that is doing all sorts of work. And you had exploration of technology, because at this time, they were doing practical research. They were trying to build better guided missiles and better lunar modules and all of this. But this was also a period where there was just a lot of pie in the sky kind of non general research into any technology that looks useful, because Congress so much, the government panicked so much that they were willing to spend lots of money on just about anything related to this kind of thing. That changes, and we'll talk about this transition later. That changes with the end of the Vietnam War, because the Vietnam War serves as a real disillusioning moment in the government's will to fund big, expensive projects. The space race is over by that point. So that's one big thing that's done. And then there's just a broader disillusionment with letting the government spend too much money. The very wasteful, from a spending perspective, Vietnam War. But right now we're in the real blue sky period of research. And so you get the government investing in electronics technology quite a bit in the late 50s and the early 60s to develop transistors, integrated circuits, the kinds of things that are needed in guided missiles and in computers for things like the space program, especially. Once all of those companies like Texas Instrument and Fairchild really established themselves within the of military research and are bringing in a lot of money from these military contracts, then they try to turn around and commoditize silicon, commoditize electronics. And really, Texas Instrument was the initial leader in this, with coming up with something that could be used by the general public that would spur increased production of transistors and then spur an increase in their in purchases of their product. They come up with the transistor radio. The first transistor radio is really not that useful. The one that they first come up with in the 50s, but just the idea of being able to carry around a radio with you is so powerful in the public mind that the transistor radio just takes off as a product. Then in the 60s, to push integrated circuits, you get calculators really coming in, both desktop and handheld calculators, in order to drive adoption of integrated circuits. This is taking the technology that had been created for the government and then turning it into a mass commodity. And Texas Instruments takes the lead there, but Fairchild and the National Semiconductor also become very big in this because there's a manufacturing guru named Charlie Spork who starts at Fairchild and then goes to National Semiconductor and is instrumental in changing the way transistors and integrated circuits are manufactured so that you can do true mass market production and turn this into a consumer product. So what does all of this mean for video games? What this means for video games is that by the mid 1970s, electronic components have become cheap enough that you can start commoditizing them both in the arcade setting and in the home setting. When Ralph Baer is doing Pong in the 1960s, why did I say Ralph Baer is doing Pong?
I don't
Well,
know.
my credibility is shot. When Ralph Baer is doing the brown box that becomes the Magnavox Odyssey in the 1960s, he is limited in what he can do to that basic dot generation because the technology is just too expensive to commoditize and to bring into the home. Even when Al Alcorn and Nolan Bushnell are doing Pong and Atari, they can get a little more performance out of the technology because they're in a commercial setting, an arcade setting where something can cost $1,000 or more, but they're still limited in what they can do. They can't do much with graphics. They can't do much with all of that non-arbitrary changing game state we were talking about because there's only so many objects that can be moving around. There's only so many shapes those objects can take. There's only so many variables you can bring into the game. Now that we have succeeded in Ralph Baer and I like that thing about the internet, Ralph Baer and the internet. I had to stop and laugh at that.
Yep.
Now that we have commoditized integrated circuits, we're getting to the point where we can take the next step. So driving and shooting games are very popular in the arcade, and they have gotten very sophisticated. Games like Periscope and Missile and Speedway. The problem with these games is they use relays, they use steppers, they use counters, they use all of these finicky mechanical parts.
And mechanical parts break down.
They break all the time. So just as the coin-operated game is reaching the apex of its sophistication in the electromechanical age, it's also reaching the limits of its capability to work properly, quite frankly. Well, solid state provides the solution to that. Solid state allows you to just do all of this through those beautiful logic gates and those beautiful ones and zeros of computer code once we get to the point that we're doing things in software. So that saves us from the maintenance issue. So you get a pivot very quickly away from the ball and paddle stuff to co-opting the audiovisual or realistic games, as they called these category of games in the trades, that were already being done in electromechanical. So that's why the next wave that you see is things like Speed Race from Taito, or Grand Track 10 from Atari, or Gunfight from Midway. You have, or Tank from Atari. You have these games where you have two players dueling each other. You don't really have much in the way of shooting gallery games yet because objects on the screen is a problem, but you can at least have two players dueling each other on the screen. Or you can have players driving around the screen and competing in that way. And this slots in very nicely with what's already going on in coin-operated games, so it's familiar to distributors and operators. It's something they can understand and will have less resistance to stalking, and they'll also love it because they can get some of the same effect that they were getting out of these big elaborate machines, without them breaking down all the time. Now, in some ways, those big EM machines were more impressive graphically and gameplay-wise than what the early video games could do, but that cost savings is significant enough that it's still worth making this transition. At first, this is a limited move because even video games, even though they don't have the problems of all of the electromechanical hardware, when you're doing this all in transistor to transistor logic, to get much happening on the screen at once still takes a lot of silicon. It still takes a lot of hardware because games at this time are entirely done in hardware. There is no software component to it. So the more sophisticated your game gets, the more transistors and integrated circuits you need. The more transistors and integrated circuits you need, the bigger the board you need. The bigger the board you need, the more likely you are going to create something that is more fragile. And that takes us to our 5-hour-long episode on Ramtech baseball that I know people in chat were looking forward to. So, in seriousness, I do have to bring up Ramtech Baseball quickly because this provides a good example of that. Ramtech Baseball was one of the first games to have more complex graphical elements on the screen. It had on-screen representations of players. It had more physics going on because you're pitching the ball and the ball can move around a little bit. So it was more sophisticated than the ball and paddle games, even though just barely. But because of that, it needed two circuit boards. Two circuit boards had to be joined together. And Ramtech used a wooden frame to do that, a wooden housing. And it turned out the wooden housing was really, really flimsy and it broke. And so the first run of the game was a disaster. They had to go out and replace all the housings. So that's an example of a problem that you're getting into as games get more sophisticated in hardware. Another good example of this is Atari did a couple of really massive multiplayer games in the mid 70s. Indy 800 being the big one, an 8-player driving game. Of course, that's called Indy 500, and I know that. Or is it Indy 800? I don't remember anymore.
Now you have to look it up. How else will we know?
Yeah, it is Indy 800. I fooled myself for a second. You see, this is the stuff that people normally don't get to see.
Yep.
Where Alex's memory goes haywire on him and plays nasty, nasty tricks. Dirty, nasty, false trickses. So, and in Indy 800, you had 8 players racing at once. But Indy 800 was, for all intents and purposes, from a design perspective, it was essentially 8 racing games combined into one, all interacting with each other. That meant that game had 8 circuit boards. They literally needed one circuit board for each player. And so this cabinet was gigantic. I mean, it had to be gigantic in part just to fit 8 people around it, but it was also gigantic because they had 8 circuit boards, and the more circuit boards you have, the more chance of failure there is. So very quickly, even as video pivots into these kind of replacing these electromechanical novelty games, they very quickly start running into the exact same problem that these electromechanical novelty games themselves ran into, which is service headaches of all types. So, just responding to chat here, this won't be part of the episode. So, Tank 8 was actually microprocessor based. Now, I'm sure it still had more than one board. Oh, that's just special effects. Don't worry. I felt my arm didn't look blue enough. Special effects. So, I'm sure Tank 8 probably still had more than one board, but it had way fewer boards than Indy 800 did. And that's a great example of exactly why moving to microprocessors was such a good idea. Electromechanical, what kind of games? So, electromechanical, just to answer that real fast, electromechanical is just referring to the fact that instead of using electronics, you are using actual moving mechanical parts, and these moving mechanical parts are powered by electricity. So, a good example of this would be target shooting games. The way target shooting games worked back in the arcade in like the 50s and 60s is that you would have uh, contacts which were electrified, and then you would have wipers, which were these pieces of metal that would move around, sometimes controlled by the player swiveling the gun, sometimes automatically controlled by the game cabinet. And when that wiper hit that contact, it would complete a circuit, and the completion of that circuit would cause the registering of a hit. Yeah, I mean, carnival games are a good example of that. So it's all about having moving parts within the game, and then using electricity and using electric circuits to register action within the game. This is as opposed to electronics, where it's all done digitally through ones and zeros, and you're still using electricity, obviously, to drive that process. But instead of that electricity causing moving parts to do things, it's that electricity coursing through logic gates, and then the on-off states causing different things to happen. I'm not a technical person, but I think that was mostly.
That was pretty good.
I think that was mostly correct.
Mostly correct. The best technical correct, which is the best kind of correct.
Yes, we'll go with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, hardware wasn't going to be the answer. Electronics were clearly the answer, but hardware could not be the answer. And of course, that's where we get that other important evolution, which is incorporating the microprocessor into the game. With the microprocessor, when you're getting most commands executed in software rather than having to build very, very complex circuit boards full of transistors and integrated circuits with all of their individual logic gates and all of that, you can have a lot of your program now happening in software. Software can do a lot of your mathematic calculations. It can take the burden off of the hardware, allowing you to shrink the hardware, while at the same time allowing you to have more complex elements. And that's really what was needed to get video games to a sustainable point. You needed the tech to get to microprocessors first. Now, it's important to note that early microprocessor driven video games, games like Gunfight and Seawolf, that were big hits, even though the microprocessor did a lot of the work, processors could not do all of the work. There were still special circuits needed for a lot of what was going on. So to get truly interesting games took a few more years. Gunfight was able to do more than Pong could, but you were still kind of limited in the number of objects you could have on the screen because you needed separate circuitry to drive to drive moving objects, for instance. You still needed separate circuitry to drive sound. Sound chips would come along. Processors just totally devoted to sound would come along by the early 1980s, but in the mid 1970s, they're not there yet. You sometimes still need separate controllers for some of your control schemes. There's a lot of stuff that's still going on, but microprocessors get us to the point where video games can start to work. So you have some games in this period that do get popular. Gunfight's pretty popular. Seawolf, which is a submarine game, is popular. But even if you look at Seawolf, it's a game that needed a lot of non-video elements to really work really well. Yeah, 6502 definitely changed the world because another part of this is, of course, that the early microprocessors are also very expensive for what you get out of them. And the 6502 was not only super cheap compared to some of the early processors, but it was way more efficient too. Again, I'm not a technical person, but my understanding is a 1 megahertz 6502 could perform essentially as well as a 3 or 4 megahertz processor from some of the other companies, just because of how efficient it was with its cycles. So, absolutely. Yeah, and the power as well, which is very important. So now I have to get train of thought back. Yeah, see, I was talking about Seawolf.
Yep.
So if you play Seawolf in MAME today, it looks fairly basic. I mean, it has nice ship graphics for the time, but you just have your ships and your, I guess they're supposed to be mines. They look like balloons, but your ships and your mines flying by at different speeds, and then you shoot a torpedo and it comes up and it makes contact with one of those things, and that thing disappears. So fun, I guess, but it doesn't seem that far removed from Pong in its audiovisual presentation. But yeah, we are so far behind. So
Yep.
far behind.
4 episodes. 4 episodes.
Yes. The train of thought is finally back on the track, but we need to figure out bullet train of thought technology if
Nope.
we're ever going to make.
Nope. 4 episodes, maybe 5.
Yeah, well, it's all worth it. It's all worth it.
Hey, if it gets me a backlog, I don't care.
But if you play it in the arcade, there's a lot of elements that are still drawn from the old electromechanical tradition that are part of the game. So you're peering through a periscope, and that periscope has a targeting crosshairs that's superimposed within the periscope itself. So that is a graphical element that you don't see in MAME, is that crosshair moving around as you're trying to target these different ships. There's sonar pings. There's sound going off that MAME does not emulate, because at this time, sound was still being done completely through hardware. And of course, MAME is software emulation. MAME, for some games, has mocked up hardware elements from games that aren't done in software, but they haven't done that uniformly across everything. So there's a sound element that you don't get just from the microprocessor. And then there's actually explosions that are done using projection technology. So they're bringing in old electromechanical projection technology to make nice big red explosions when you blow something up. And of course, MAME doesn't capture that, because that's not even electronic hardware. That's going back to the old electromechanical days. So you've got a period where there's a lot of hybrid stuff going on. You get elaborate backgrounds that are being done either through silk screening directly on the cabinet, or by recessing the monitor and then using a mirror to project the image from the monitor over top of something sculpted. So this was a real hybrid period, but it's a period where the games, by borrowing from a combination of the new video technology and the old electromechanical technology, are starting to become something more sophisticated and interesting. The one thing that's still missing from that is excitement and unpredictability. And it's for this reason that even though video is becoming more sophisticated and some games are becoming more popular, that you're still getting overshadowed at this point by pinball. So video games helped legitimize pinball. It's kind of funny because now that coin-operated entertainment is seen as respectable, which video games played a big part of, pinball is taking on a new life of respectability as well, and is becoming legal in places where it had previously been illegal. On top of that, the advances in solid-state technology that are appearing in video games are also appearing in pinball machines, and are actually being worked on first in pinball machines even before they're worked on in video games, because you can use a 4-bit processor to drive a pinball machine because there's no display. You cannot use a 4-bit processor to drive a video game because a 4-bit processor is quite simply not powerful enough to drive a display under any circumstances. Well, I shouldn't say under any circumstances, but under any realistic and edifying circumstances.
What if
put
I
it that
wanted to
way.
play Life on a really, really small screen?
Yeah, I mean, obviously 4-bit processors did drive LED handhelds. So, I mean, you can have a display, but not the type of display that is going to lead to something edifying. So, pinball is going solid state at the same time as video is going solid state. And again, we won't get detailed into the history, too late, but we'll pretend we're not going detailed into the history. But suffice to say, pinball is going solid state, and solid state pinball really revolutionizes things as well, because pinball had gone competitive in the 1950s. That's the first time that you started seeing 2-player pinball machines where you would alternate. One person would play, they'd rack up a score, until they lost all their balls. Or until they lost a ball, they'd alternate ball to ball. This is getting naughty. But then the next player would come in and play their ball, and then their score would be there, and so on and so forth. The game could track 2 scores, but it was using electromechanical scoring reels to do this. So it could save the state of the scores, but it couldn't save the state of the game. Pinball throughout the 50s and especially the 60s was getting more sophisticated, where you're not just hitting a bumper and scoring a point. You're getting to the point where you have elaborate targets. You're getting to the point where you have portions of the board that are worth more points depending on when you hit them. And you have all of these complex timing things that are infiltrating in the 1960s and are integral into making pinball less a random chaotic game of stuff bouncing around and more a game of structure and skill, where you're trying to get good at using your bumpers to aim your ball to a particular part of the table at a particular time to get a particular amount of points. This is also part of, incidentally, what helps legitimize pinball in the 1970s and takes it away from its gambling roots. There is real skill involved at this point, even if there's still a lot of random chance as well. So you could keep track of 2 scores at once, but you couldn't remember the state of the board. If player 1 had an 8 times combo going at the end of his ball, when he lost his ball, that if he were playing single player, when he got his next ball, he could continue with that 8-time combo. But if you're alternating, basically every bit of knowledge about player 1 is lost by the machine except for his score when you move to player 2. Solid state with microprocessors, you could save the game state of player 1 and return to it when player 2's turn was done. So this was a true revolution in the way pinball functioned and the way the game pinball functioned, and made for a more compelling product. You also have 2 other things going on in this period that I think are important. One is you have the movie Pinball Wizard, sorry. You have the movie Pinball Wizard, based, of course, on the Who album from several years prior, that is more closely bringing together several different kinds of teenage pursuits. So bringing in rock music, which is popular with the kids these days. You're bringing in pinball, which maybe wasn't as popular with the kids, but is becoming popular with the kids. And you're bringing around Anne Margaret rolling around in baked beans or something. And, you couldn't go wrong as a teenager with Anne Margaret in the 1970s. So you're bringing in these teenage elements together.
Yeah, it's supposed to be supposed to be Tommy, not wizards. The game
Good
itself calls for
Lord.
wizards.
I'm well aware of the difference between Tommy and Pinball Wizard. Good Lord. I blame the blue LEDs in my arm injecting me with LED poison. Oh, good Lord. Oh, good Lord. No, yeah, terribly sorry. That's one of those moments. Tommy.
So how do
is
you want
the
to
album.
re-record that?
Probably later.
Okay.
I mean, normally we'd record it right now, but with stream of thought, with interacting with chat, I think it's impossible. So we
Okay,
will re-record that later.
I'll mark it during the editing notes.
Oh Lord. So you have Tommy bringing together all of these elements, and then you have Bally making the decision, thanks to a particular marketing executive, Tom Neiman, to license Tommy to create the Wizard machine based on the song Pinball Wizard. That sound about right?
That sounds about right. We covered this before in a previous episode, but yeah.
Yes, well, I may need to be comfortably numb here soon.
Oh.
The pain definitely needs to recede. The pain and the shame.
Well, you'll have to come over for some amaretto later or something.
That's right. I told you I'm not a real historian. I just play one on TV.
Yeah, see, we're on TV right now. We have him over here somewhere. Yeah, there's my finger.
I warned you up front.
Yep.
So a synergy is created between Tommy and Wizard and Anne Margaret, because they use Anne Margaret in the promotional materials. That's right. We go from the gut here at They Create Worlds. We're all about the truth. We're all about the truthiness, not the truth.
That's right.
Which creates a new place for pinball in the imagination of the teenage set. This is happening at the same time that coin-operated games are coming into the shopping mall. So, of course, the shopping mall is becoming a hangout for teens. And then also, I think, quite frankly, this is the 1970s. This is the period of hyperinflation. This is the period of time when everyone is getting laid off, unemployment up to 10%, where money is rapidly becoming worthless, where the country is just in kind of a serious economic state. And I think it cannot be a coincidence that pinball suddenly surges in popularity, particularly with teenagers, in this period of hyperinflation bookended by recession. Because as all of this is going on, coin-operated entertainment is staying at this 25-cent level. Now, pinball is moving to pure 25 cents from 2 to 25 cents, but it's able to maintain that quarter price during this entire period. And so as other forms of entertainment, I'm sure, are suddenly becoming much more expensive, things like records and movies and all of that, you get a flocking once again, just like you did in the Great Depression, to coin-operated amusements. So this is kind of the final twist in bringing coin-op to the state that it would be at the start of the Golden Age. We've come from a working class entertainment primarily found in bars to a teenage entertainment that is more and more becoming centered around the arcade, whether that arcade is in an enclosed shopping mall or is in a strip mall. You're getting that going. Now, at this point, video games haven't really made it into street locations very much yet. Obviously, they were in the bars already, and they kind of got into cocktail lounges. But other street locations like convenience stores are actually kind of sticking with pinball. But pinball is experiencing this massive surge in popularity. The solid state helps. The Tommy connection helps. I do think the recession helps. But what I think really sets pinball apart and what helps it in a way that video games are not helped by, say, this hyperinflation environment is that pinball is exciting and unpredictable. You get your 3 balls or your 5 balls. You launch it on there. There's lots of action. You never know quite where the ball's going to go. You have to really pay close attention with your flippers to make sure you're batting at the right time and in the right place. And there's a real sense of danger. There's a sense that your game is going to end. Your game could end after 5 seconds if you really suck. Your game could extend for minute upon minute upon minute if you're particularly good at it. But even if you're good at it, you're still going to get that bad bounce eventually that knocks you out of the running. Video games, in contrast, in this time period, are predictable. And predictability leads to boredom. Games are tuned around time limits in almost every case. Driving games in particular, you're driving for 60 minutes or 90 minutes. If you are good enough at your driving and accumulate enough score, which is usually factored by driving progress, then maybe you'll get an extended period. Maybe you get another 30 seconds. But then your game is over. Shooting gallery games like Seawolf, which is very popular, 10,000 units, and 10,000 units was a heck of a lot back then. It's timed game. You're shooting at things until the clock runs out and you're getting whatever score you get. Some of the dueling games or the ball and paddle games like Pong, it's to a score. So there is some variation and some excitement in how that game's going to play out based on reaching the score, the number of kills first, in the case of something like a tank. But it's still a set endpoint. And it's still not that unpredictable because most of those games, you have very few objects on the screen at once. So it's not a very chaotic, target-rich environment like a pinball environment is. And I think this is why video games go through a lot of ups and downs. You know, they're huge in 73, they crash in 74. That's the Pong boom. They rise in 75 and 76 because games like Gunfight, Wheels, which is the American version of Speed Race, we will get into Japan a little more detail later, and Tank provides something new and exciting that people haven't seen before, Seawolf, but that kind of gets to the limit of that style of gameplay. They're limited by the technology. They've got some ROMs in there now for more sophisticated graphics, but they can only go so far. They're limited by the gameplay mechanics that they have. They're timed games, they're scored games. It's kind of it gets prosaic. So as 76 turns to 77, games are kind of more of the same. It's the same kind of thing. In 77 and 78, it kind of gets prosaic again. At the exact same moment, pinball is getting more exciting and getting more attached to youth culture. So video rises big, falls big, rises a little more, falls a little more. They're still doing okay, but there's a real sense that maybe this isn't something that is going to necessarily last. In the meantime, we have to briefly, not that anything's brief, we're never brief. This is like a 15-point outline, and we're on like point 4.
Or do you want, that was something I was going to bring up with you. Do you want to break it when you get into the birth of Japan? Because it seems like we get done with the handhelds and the programables, and then break there for the next episode, and then go into Japan, break out, so on and so forth.
Well, we'll at least take a break on stream. We might be able to coax a little more out of the episode because the episode's not really 2 hours. There's a lot of dead time in there.
Okay, I just want to get to the end of the episode, whatever. So you think you can get to all of 4?
We need a little farther before we end the episode.
Okay,
this probably is going to be a 6-episode extravaganza, but that's okay.
We'll survive.
We'll make it work. Really, let's not even try. in all seriousness, now you have to see how the sausage gets made again. In all seriousness, we will do bumpers and stingers for later episodes later. Let's just get all of this recorded in one big long block.
Okay.
And once we really know how long everything is, then we can figure out what episode cuts need to be. Yeah.
Okay. All right. If you want to do it that way, we can do that. So we'll just continue recording.
Yeah.
That's going to be interesting.
That's how we always did it before. The only one we didn't do that for was the top 100 games, because we knew it was 40, 40, 20. So we knew where the breaks were in advance.
Oh, yeah. I'm thinking like the actual files themselves, but that's... When we break, we'll have to stop it and then do new things, and I can combine things together later.
Yep. But anyway, we've bored the people long enough.
Okay.
They're
on to Japan.
They're starting to compare ball lengths or something. So we need to get them back on topic.
That doesn't sound wholesome. Okay, so next on the docket.
Yeah. So we do need to turn briefly to the home. Home games really started when you got large-scale integrated circuits, when you could really get an entire game, simple game like Pong, on a single chip. You had the Magnavox Odyssey. The Magnavox Odyssey was in production from 72 to 75. It did sell over that period of time somewhere north of 300,000 units, which isn't the worst thing in the world. But it couldn't be that sophisticated. It couldn't be that fun. It was 3 dots in a line. There wasn't even a score. It used overlays to do more complex game elements. And those overlays were limited really in what they could add. They used cards, they used dice. One game even used a game board. It was a mess. It was a good attempt, but it was too limited by the technology. You needed those integrated circuits, and particularly large scale integration circuits. Some of the early ones did use medium scale integration, but you needed 3 or 4 chips with medium scale integration. Large scale integration, you could do it all on one chip. And just to clarify, when I talk about integration like that, that's how many transistors you can fit on a single sliver of silicon. And there's definitions. I don't have them in front of me, but I think medium scale integration's like up to 500 or something, and large scale is more than that. Those numbers could be completely wrong. It doesn't matter. So once you had the capability to get Pong, a fairly primitive game, on a single chip, that spurred an adoption in the home. The Pong fad had kind of run out in the arcade at that point, but as much as anything, I think that had to do with the fact that, grown men were getting tired of pumping quarters into a machine for very limited gameplay. You're just not getting a lot of bang for your buck. Bringing Pong into the home gets rid of that problem of eating your savings one quarter at a time, but it also allows you to get the whole family involved theoretically and get your kids involved with it. There really isn't a good environment for younger kids yet to play games, which is a big part of the reason why bringing in them into the home in this time period is valuable as a way of expanding the audience. Obviously, you're not typically going to be bringing your kids to a beer bar. No judgment, but probably not. And arcades, because of their reputation, are not a place that you're going to be comfortable leaving your kids either. Shopping mall arcades are changing that a little bit, but the shopping mall arcade thing is still only growing slowly in the mid-70s. You don't have shopping mall arcades on every street corner yet, like you would a few years later. So bringing Pong into the home gives it a second life, I think, as much as anything, because it's something for the children. Think of the children. It's very expensive. You're talking about games that are costing $100 for the Atari model. Once GI, the chip company, is able to commoditize the chips, you're looking at games that are $70. That doesn't sound like much, but we have to remember that we all live after that period of hyperinflation that I was alluding to earlier. So we do our favorite thing and go to a handy dandy inflation calculator.
We do? Oh, no.
If in 1975 I purchased an item for $99.99,
I'll just call it
then
100.
no, 99.99. Then in 2020, I am spending $476.52.
The old equivalent of an Xbox or a PlayStation right now.
That's right. So, yeah, we talk about, how exorbitant the price of something like, say, a PlayStation 3 was at launch. That was one of the ones that really got people rebelling over the price of a video game. Well, you were paying that same amount of money to the good folks at Sears to buy an Atari created, Sears branded Pong system. All it does is let two people bat a ball back and forth. It does keep score. Very fancy for
Ooh.
1975. It has alphanumerics and everything to keep score. And it has a rainbow of color. Home Pong is in color. It's not a real color game. By what I mean by that is that they don't define colors for individual things. Al Alcorn was just a very savvy TV engineer going way back, and he knew a very cheap in the sense of hardware, way to get color television to just run through the entire spectrum of colors across the screen. So color was a real gimmick in Home Pong, but it did have color. So for $100, you got a rainbow of colors, two paddles, a ball, a center line, some decent physics, and a score. That's not exactly, getting Uncharted 2. So this was expensive, which makes it a tough sell. But even though this was a period of hyperinflation and recession and somewhat high level of unemployment, uh, high for post-war non-COVID America. I mean, nothing compared to the Great Depression. But relatively high. This was still a period of time when leisure was becoming a bigger part of American life. Um, again, not a full-blown social historian, so you can bear with me a little bit, but you'd had the boomer generation, of course, and so you had a large number of children, and then those large number of children became a large number of teenagers, and then a large number of professionals. You had automobiles and interstate highways and subdivisions changing patterns of behavior, and so you kind of had a leisure culture that was growing in the United States that was very different than what you had ever seen before. You had the idea of, if you were someone that was fortunate enough to have a slightly larger house, which was certainly not everybody in the 1970s, because one of the things that the hyperinflation of the 1970s did is basically put home ownership out of the reach of a heck of a lot of people, because you had like 20% interest rates on mortgages. The government tried to combat inflation with ludicrous interest rates. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. But if you were lucky enough to have a larger home because you had more kids around, you kind of had the idea of the family rec room or the family rumpus room or the family game room. You had this idea that you were starting to bring expensive items into the home for entertainment. You might get a ping pong table. Table tennis was very big in the 70s after the whole ping pong diplomacy thing, and sending our people over to play the Chinese, and Forrest Gump impressing everybody, because that was history, definitely. But table tennis was very popular, so people were getting table tennis. People were getting pool tables for the home. There was this idea that you could bring an expensive item into the home and make it something for family entertainment. So even though home pong was expensive, it was seen as a legitimate extension of this rec room culture that was already becoming a part of American life and American society. And this is why home pong, incidentally, first appeared in the sporting goods department at Sears, not in the toy department, not in the television department. Certainly, there wouldn't have been something as broad based as a consumer electronics department yet, because TVs and radios were basically the entire sum of consumer electronics. But it appeared in the sporting goods department because the sporting goods in the winter, they were really supplementing a lot of their bats and balls and whatever else you would find there normally with items were considered vaguely sporty that were being brought into the home. So it became a ping pong and pool table business in large part alongside indoor sports equipment like basketballs in the winter. So Tom Quinn, a very visionary buyer at Sears, saw the Magnavox Odyssey, the original Odyssey, which had representations of sports like table tennis, tennis, and hockey, and said, okay, this is something that you can fit in the family activity room. This is something you can put next to the ping pong table and is something that has a vaguely sports-like connotation similar to a ping pong or pool table. So let's sell the Odyssey. And we didn't talk about this, but one of the limiters of the spread of the Odyssey was of that they limited the Odyssey to Magnavox dealers, organizations that specifically dealt in Magnavox products and only Magnavox products. Management had gotten a little more progressive by the mid 1970s. I think in part because the company was in pretty dire straits financially. I'm sure in part it very well could have been they were bought by the Dutch and Philips might have looked at that dealer restriction stuff and thought it was stupid. I have no idea if that's true. I wish we had more information on Philips and its relationship with video games. Our Dutch folk need to get on that. You're out there. We know you're out there. We talk to you. Some of you may even be in this chat right now. Get on that. But for whatever reason, they were starting to loosen that by 1974. So they still weren't going to allow Sears to sell it in store, but they were going to allow them to put it in the Sears catalog, which they did. It appears in the catalog in 74. So Quinn's looking for product at the same time Atari is looking for buyers, and they can't get anyone interested because it's such a strange fit. It's considered a toy in the home because it's for recreation. The toy industry does not deal in $100 products. They just don't. If it's over $30, it's a bicycle. You know, some bigger toy stores sell bikes, and those may be more than $30, and that's it. Otherwise, toy buyers are cutting off at $30. They're not comfortable in dealing with stuff higher than that. Consumer electronics isn't really a thing yet. It's just TVs and radios. And even though there's a logical synergy between television and video games, the TV companies in general aren't very interested in it. They actually tried the Sears television department first, and they weren't interested. And Magnavox had tried interesting Sears back in the day. And back then they weren't interested because they didn't want the television department to become a babysitter, because you set up a demo unit and then the kids stay in the television department all day and they're being all rambunctious, and then the adults don't come in and buy televisions. So nobody was interested, but Sporting Goods was interested just because of this. The original Odyssey. So one of the companies that, I probably came in on that in the wrong way. Never mind. Chat amongst yourselves, talk amongst yourselves. That's the problem with looking at chat only periodically. But Sporting Goods came in and was interested because of this whole rec room, winter indoor activity, rise in leisure connotation. So it comes into the Sporting Goods department and department store. At this time, it has to be a department store item because it's so expensive. You're not going to get a $500 item into Kmart. I mean, equivalent to today of $500, $100 at the time. You're not going to get a $100 toy, $500 in today's money into. So it's a department store item. It comes through Sears, and video games have enough of a cachet now that that it sells. It sells really well. And it lifts all boats. Home Pong is not the best seller. The Magnavox new system is actually the new seller. They take the Odyssey, they put it on some MSI chips, 3 to 4 of them, depending on the system, and they scale down to just the ball and paddle games because they're not blind. They saw what sold in the arcade, and it wasn't Simon Says or Haunted House. So they slim down to the ball and paddle product, They actually sell more than Atari because they have a greater manufacturing capability. Some novelty companies also get in because there's also been a move at the same time, just like pool tables are coming into the home and ping pong's coming into the home. Air hockey, which was brand new at about the same time Pong was, is coming into the home. You have novelty companies that are making miniature pool table and air hockey tables, and they get into the home Pong business. So you get a Pong business going, but you get into the same challenges that you had in the arcade. Pong is a very limited thing, and you get a rapid kind of boom of the product and a rapid tiring of the product. So once Atari and Magnavox get in, it takes specialists to get in and invent the stuff in the first place. But once the specialists get in, you get a chip company like, say, General Instrument, just developing an entire game on a single chip where all you have to provide is casing and controls and other little peripheral stuff, and you make that chip available cheaply, then suddenly everybody can get in. And there's already a consumer electronics business that's in a nascent form at this time. I mentioned that it's mostly televisions and radios, and that's true, but the calculator industry and the handheld calculator industry is just starting to get big, starting in 1971, 1972. This brings in a lot of companies because, again, you have chip companies that are making the calculators on a chip, and then you get a variety of other companies that are taking advantage of this to do their own thing. And there are two main types of companies that are doing this, and it's all based in the Far East. The Far East is already becoming known as a place where you can do manufacturing cheaper. And it's becoming a place where you're having just enough expertise with electronics now, where they've recovered enough from the war that they are starting to get technologically sophisticated. They always lag behind in this period, the United States, in terms of inventing new things. But the Japanese recognize very early on that their capacity for efficiency and manufacturing efficiency, which is really great, is a perfect match for the semiconductor industry. And so Japanese electronics corporations and Japanese engineers and Japanese scientists almost take transistors and semiconductors more seriously than the Americans do. There are stories about how early pioneers like Bob Noyce, one of the inventors of the one of the inventors of the integrated circuit, would go to conferences in the United States to talk about ICs and transistors, and maybe the room would be half full, and then you'd go to that's what this podcast is. That's what we should have called the podcast. We should call the podcast the Integrated Circus. But
Too late
or
now.
at least the stream. Or at least the stream. The stream is definitely the Integrated Circus. But when Noyce would go to Japan, he would play to packed houses because the Japanese were paying attention. They saw how they could take this really finicky technology and use their penchant for efficiency and miniaturization and manufacturing capability to really make a big difference. So this is a lot of why you start seeing this kind of activity move towards the Far East, both that efficiency and that cheapness. Of course, that cheapness keeps migrating. What's cheap in Japan then becomes cheap in Taiwan, becomes cheap in Hong Kong. It's a cycle. Now it's cheap in Thailand or whatever. But it's kind of that whole Asian migration thing starting, and Japan is a big part of that in the early days. Hong Kong is also a big part of it in the early days. And you have both Japanese companies like Busicom and Casio and Sharp that are creating product cheaply. And then you have importers. You have Americans, often Jews, only because there's a lot of Far Eastern connection that has to do with Russian, migration of Russian Jews during the revolution to the Far East, and then Japanese conquest and all of this stuff. There's actually a lot of Jewish connection with the Far East. So you have a lot of Jewish American entrepreneurs, largely based in New York, who have a lot of contacts with Japan and with the Far East, and they are creating import companies where they will go to Hong Kong more so than Japan, have a local manufacturer manufacture something that they can bring over under their brand name. So you have this huge consumer electronics apparatus, as well as many, many cats, many, many loving black cats, who are creating this new calculator industry, but they are flooding the market with product. Also, because of this calculator industry and the shift to the Far East, you have companies in Japan, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan becoming more comfortable with the underlying technology, so that it's starting to get to the point where the American companies are afraid that they've given away, in a sense, too many of their secrets to the Japanese. Right now, all the Japanese and the Hong Kong folk are doing is creating the shell and the casing these systems. But there's a very real fear that because of the expertise they're getting through this exchange of technology, that they're going to start creating the underlying chips as well. And this really scares companies like Texas Instruments, which at this time have a monopoly on this kind of stuff going on with them. And so what you get as the result of that is you get the unprecedented move of Texas Instrument deciding that they will not only create the integrated circuits, they will also create the consumer electronics themselves, which before had never really been the case. So Texas Instrument enters the market with its own calculator. The other big companies like National Semiconductor and are required essentially to follow suit to keep up. These companies can undercut
Uh-oh.
their prices, can chips cost.
Yeah.
I'm frozen. Are we still on? Okay.
You're
I was frozen for a second. I was making sure we were still on stream.
Yep, we're still on stream. I think it's just your network went nuts for a few seconds.
Yep. No worries. And it leads to a ruinous price war that destroys the calculator industry. I mean, you're talking about in a period of 3 years, you had handheld calculators going from like a $50, $60, $70 item to $9.95. It was an insane crash in price, and it destroyed profitability for almost everybody.
Almost everybody.
Yeah, I'm just taking a water break.
Oh, water? That's silly. Not like you've been talking for 2 hours.
Yes. So this creates two very real problems. On the one hand, this creates two paradigm shifts. On the one hand, it means that the chip companies are kind of permanently linked with now being consumer electronics companies as well. This will come back to haunt us at various times. The other paradigm shift is you have all of these companies, whether they be the Japanese OEM people or the Hong Kong OEM people or the New York-based importers like Unisonic and APF and Umtech, and also actually I think Umtech's one of the Hong Kong companies. It's hard to keep everybody straight. All of these companies are suddenly at a loss for a product. They need something new. So that General Instrument video game chip comes out in a period of time when that industry is scrambling for something. And that's why suddenly the market is flooded by video games from dozens upon dozens of companies. You needed Magnavox and Atari to lead the way, but then everybody else gets involved. This leads to the same problem that happened in calculators. You immediately get the market kind of hollowing out. So 1976 is a huge year. 1977, the middle is destroyed because 76, there was overproduction. It was still a good year, but because there was overproduction, there was price cutting at the beginning of 1977. Price cutting really hurts the industry through the rest of 77. There's a hollowing out of the middle where really cheap systems do well. High-end systems, at this point, programmable systems that we'll talk about later that are coming in do well. Mid-range systems fall apart completely. So then you have companies stuck with a lot of inventory. You have another round of price cutting, and this has consequences even into 1978 because 1977 was so disastrous that in 1978 companies become conservative and they decide they're going to order less product. So even the video game product that is still selling okay, they're not going to order as much of. So it creates a lot of problems, but it is the beginning of the video game in the home being part of the public consciousness. At the same time, though, this creates a conundrum for the toy companies. Toy companies are still not comfortable with this idea of an $100 product. A General Instrument video game can sell for cheaper, can sell for $70, but even that is a pretty bad price point for a toy company. But the toy companies understand that this electronic stuff is going to steal consumers away from traditional toys because the home games are seen more as a toy, whereas the arcade games are clustered around the teenage culture and sometimes pull in people a little older even than teenagers. The home product is seen as a toy. You know, adults go out to have fun. Kids, you know, stare at the television all day to have fun or something like that.
I thought they went outside and played baseball
Well, yeah, something like that.
and swam in rivers and played jacks.
Yes. Jacks.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of funny that Fairchild or Atari in the early days didn't create a Jacks game when they were creating stupid versions of so many other stupid games. Surprised they never created a Jacks game.
It was a popular game back then, so I'm surprised they didn't.
Yes. Video games or TV is much safer. TV won't hurt you. TV is your friend. TV won't try to drown you.
But I need that water for drinking. There's not much of it left. I'm almost out. I have a cat that's keeping me here. It won't let me escape.
So you did have one toy company in Coleco that was very bold and decided they could sell a $70 product. And that was important to video games because Coleco, being a toy company getting involved, made toy buyers get a little more comfortable in this. So we're talking about, on the business side of things, trying to spread the retail distribution and get out of weird areas like sporting goods. It'll persist in things like sporting goods, but Coleco getting in helps legitimize it with toy buyers as well at stores. But for the majority of the industry, it's just not comfortable to get into that, which is why you see the subsequent rise of the electronic LED handheld game, which starts at Mattel, but then spreads to other companies like Parker Brothers and Milton Bradley. And electronics start taking over the toy industry more broadly. So you have the low end getting kind of overrun by this. Even though you have price games falling, video games aren't a good fit for the low end of the market because the handhelds are coming in at the low end of the market. At the high end of the market, you have the programmables, but the programmables are having trouble kind of proving themselves in this time period. So you get the market kind of hollowing out where the sophisticated, for the time, video games in the middle in your kind of $50 to $100 price range just aren't making it anymore. And so just at the same time that you have the arcade, the coin-op industry kind of falling apart a little bit, you have the home industry, which is a separate industry. It's tempting to label a complete video game industry, but this separate home industry is also falling apart. And it's not altogether clear that video games won't just be a fad that are replaced by something else that is more interesting or more sustainable long term, because at this time, video games are very limited and quite simply, in some ways, very boring. And that's what kind of takes us to the end of this first chunk, which means we're probably going to be like 4 or 5 episodes. Not that we're going to do we're not going to do a stinger at this point, but this may end up being where it breaks. I don't know.
From what I know about how this stuff tends to cut, this would make a good first episode. It
Mhm.
would cut down to about an hour 45. It would be my guess.
Right. Very good. That's how you get to a point, both in terms of the technology, in terms of society, in terms of interest, where the video game may have really been in trouble if not for the arrival of Space Invaders. And so that's kind of brings us into what is going to be our part 2. Though I think we should take a minute or 2 here before we do that.
All right. So what we'll do is I will stop my recording so that we have this in a concise chunk. So that's
Yep.
going to be our first episode, and we'll start the recording for the next one. I'm going to push stop on mine,
I'm doing the same.
and then I'm going to tell it to save everything. Save all. Okay. And then Alex and I are going to take a, what do you say, 10 to 15 minute break?
Oh, I don't think we need. I don't
Or
think we
five,
need.
5 to 10 minutes?
I think a 5-minute break will be fine.
All right, we'll try to get back here in about 5, worst case 10 minutes. In the meantime, you kids can chat amongst yourselves, have fun, and do your thingy. And we will be back shortly.
Don't do your thingy. That's not good.
Whatever
Do-
wholesome thing you want to
do-
put into place.
Do your thingy on your own time, okay? You know. This is Twitch. It's a wholesome environment, he
That's
says.
true. And you and your gutter mind. This is how we just go downhill from here. Anyway, we're going to take a break. You kids have fun.